Welcome, curious minds, to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling, well, one of the biggest aviation mysteries ever, Malaysia Airlines Flight 370.
It really is huge.
Yeah, March 8, 2014. A plane just disappears, Kuala Lumpur to Beijing, gone. People still call it, the greatest mystery in aviation history.
And that's what we're diving into. It's not just like a missing plane story. It's about how information or the lack of it, technology, human factors all collided.
Right.
We've gone through the official reports, the satellite stuff, the expert theories, all of it. The idea is to give you the clearest picture possible based on what's known without getting lost in all the noise.
So laying out the facts, figuring out the search, and looking at the questions that are still hanging out there, yeah.
Exactly. What happened, how they looked for it, and what we still don't know.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning, the last known moments. Flight 370 takes off from Kuala Lumpur, 12:42 a.m. local time. On board, 227 passengers, 12 crew. The pilots, Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah, very experienced, 52 years old, over 18,000 flight hours.
A ton of experience, and he was even an examiner for that aircraft type.
And First Officer Farik Abdul Hamid. Younger guy, 26, but, nearly 3,000 hours. And this was actually his last training flight, like final checkout.
Yeah, quite poignant in hindsight. So they take off, everything seems normal. Then at 1:19 a.m., 38 minutes into the flight, you get the last voice message to air traffic control.
The famous one.
The very routine one. Good night, Malaysian 370. Simple as that.
And then just minutes later, silence.
Right. At 1:21 a.m., its transponder just stops transmitting. So on civilian radar screens, the kind that rely on that transponder signal, MH370 basically just blinks out, vanishes.
Okay, but here's where it gets, really strange, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Civilian radar loses it, but military radar doesn't.
Exactly. Malaysian military primary radar, which works differently, it just bounces signals off objects, doesn't need a transponder. It kept tracking something for another whole hour.
And that something wasn't flying towards Beijing anymore.
Not at all. It made a sharp turn westward, flew back across the Malay Peninsula, out over the Andaman Sea, and then it finally flew out of their radar range too, at 2:22 a.m.
And the most baffling thing, no distress call, nothing. No word about weather, no hint of technical trouble. It just turned and disappeared from radar.
Complete silence. Which leads us to the next chapter, the satellite. Because even after all radar contact was gone, the plane wasn't entirely silent.
The Inmarsat data. This was the big breakthrough, wasn't it?
It was. So the plane has this satellite communication system, the SDU. It seems like it lost power sometime between 1:07 a.m. and 2:03 a.m. We don't know exactly why.
Can we link to the transponder going off?
Possibly. But then the really crucial part. At 2:25 a.m., after it left military radar range, the SDU powers back up and sends a log-on request to the Inmarsat satellite. It reestablished contact.
So it was off radar, but talking to a satellite again, silently.
Kind of, yeah. It wasn't sending flight data like ACARS anymore, but the system itself was on. And once it was back online, it automatically responded to these hourly status checks, these pings, from Inmarsat.
And that kept going for hours.
It did. Until 8:19 in the morning. That's almost 7 hours after it vanished from military radar. There were even a couple of attempts to call the plane from the ground via satellite phone.
Oh, yeah.
At 2:39 a.m. and 7:13 a.m. The SDU acknowledged the calls, like the system registered them, but nobody answered on the flight deck.
So these pings, they weren't GPS locations, right?
Yeah.
How did they figure out where the plane went from just pings?
Great question. They used two fairly technical bits of data from those pings. First was the burst time offset, the BTO, basically how long the signal took to travel between the plane and the satellite.
Okay, like measuring distance.
Exactly. It tells you the distance, which means the plane had to be somewhere on a specific arc, a specific circle on the Earth's surface at the time of each ping.
Got it. And the second thing?
That was the burst frequency offset, or BFO. This one's a bit like the Doppler effect, how an ambulance siren changes pitch as it passes you.
Right.
The plane's movement relative to the satellite caused tiny shifts in the signal's frequency. By analyzing those shifts, investigators could estimate the plane's speed and general direction north or south along those arcs.
And putting the BTO arcs and the BFO direction together
led them to conclude the plane most likely flew south deep into the southern Indian Ocean, probably until it literally ran out of fuel.
Wow. So that final ping, the one at 8:19 a.m., that defined the last arc.
That defined the seventh arc, yes. And that became the absolute cornerstone for defining the potential crash area. It led to that awful announcement on March 24th, 2014.
The Malaysian Prime Minister saying, essentially, it ended in the southern Indian Ocean. All lives presumed lost.
A devastating conclusion based purely on that satellite data analysis.
Which kicked off this just enormous search effort. First, they looked in the South China Sea, where it first disappeared from civilian radar.
Right, the logical first place.
But then, with the satellite data pointing south, the focus shifted to this massive, remote area of the southern Indian Ocean. And when you say massive,
It's almost impossible to comprehend the scale and the cost. It became the most expensive aviation search in history. We're talking about an area famous for, terrible weather, huge waves, and incredibly deep water.
searching for wreckage on the seabed, thousands of meters down, it's mind-boggling.
Totally. They did surface searches first, then moved to underwater sonar mapping, scanned 120,000 square kilometers, a huge area.
Yeah.
But ultimately, nothing. The main wreckage wasn't found. They suspended that phase in January 2017.
Why was it so hard? Beyond the scale and depth, you mentioned the beacons.
Yeah, the underwater locator beacons, the ULBs on the black boxes. They're supposed to ping their location if the plane crashes in water, but their batteries only last about 30, maybe 40 days.
And MH370 was missing for weeks before they even knew where to look in the Indian Ocean.
Exactly. Time was against them. And here's a really worrying detail that came out. The battery for the ULB on the flight data recorder might have actually expired back in December 2012.
What? Months before the flight?
Yeah, over a year before. It just highlights a potential gap in maintenance oversight that the whole industry had to confront after this.
Incredible. But some pieces did wash ashore, didn't they? Confirming it likely ended up in that ocean.
Yes, absolutely. The first and maybe most important find was the flaperone, part of the wing.
Found on Reunion Island, way over near Africa, in July 2015.
That's right. And they confirmed it was from MH370 with certainty, using serial numbers. It was even covered in these specific barnacles, Lepus and Atifra.
Oh yeah, I remember they tried to analyze the barnacles to figure out its drift path.
They did, trying to use biology to solve an aviation mystery. Then other bits turned up. Off Mozambique, they found part of a horizontal stabilizer and a piece of flap-track fairing. One had no step written on it. Another had a code, 676EB, that matched Malaysian Airlines style. Then, a piece with the Rolls-Royce engine logo washed up in South Africa. Another part of a flap in Tanzania. Bits in Mauritius.
And the locations all fit with ocean currents from the suspected crash zone.
Broadly, yes. The drift analysis supported the idea that the plane went down somewhere along that seventh arc in the southern Indian Ocean.
And the search hasn't entirely stopped. You mentioned Ocean Infinity.
Right. They did a private, no-find, no-fee search back in 2018. Didn't find the main wreckage. But incredibly, just this year, 2025, they've started a new search in a targeted 15,000 square kilometer area. The determination is still there.
It's amazing. So, okay, we have the vanishing act, the satellite clues, the debris, but the big question remains, why? What happened on that plane? The official report didn't give a definitive answer, did it?
No, the Malaysian Ministry of Transport's final report in 2018 was inconclusive on the cause. But, crucially, it did state that the turnaround, the deviation from the flight path, was done manually.
Manually, so not autopilot failure, not some system glitch taking over. Someone flew the plane off course.
That's what the report concluded, either by the pilot or a third party, which naturally leads to the theories about human intervention.
And the pilot theory, specifically murder-suicide, has been discussed a lot.
It has. Malaysian police apparently did identify Captain Zahari as the prime suspect if it was human intervention. And interestingly, the former Australian PM, Tony Abbott, later said that his understanding right from the top levels in Malaysia was that they suspected pilot murder-suicide very early on.
Which is quite a statement.
It is. It suggests that was a strong line of thinking internally, even if not publicly stated with certainty.
And then there's the flight simulator. That detail caused a stir.
Yeah, the FBI analyzed the captain's home flight simulator. They found a deleted flight path simulation that went deep into the southern Indian Ocean, quite similar to the presumed actual flight path.
Initially kept quiet, right?
It wasn't in the main public reports initially, but the Malaysian government did eventually confirm it, though they downplayed it, saying it was just one of many simulations and nothing sinister. Still, it adds to the speculation.
What about other possibilities? Passenger involvement.
That was looked at very closely early on, especially because 2 passengers boarded using stolen passports. Big red flag initially.
I remember that.
But it turned out they were Iranian asylum seekers, likely heading for Europe, with no known links to terror groups. Interpol eventually stated pretty clearly it was not a terrorist incident involving passengers. China also cleared its citizens.
Okay. And the cargo. There were batteries on board, right? Lithium-ion?
Yes, 221 kilograms of them, plus a shipment of mangosteen fruit. Both were investigated thoroughly to rule out, a fire or some kind of sabotage related to the cargo. No evidence was found to support that.
So if it wasn't passengers or cargo, maybe not the pilot. What else? There was the hypoxia theory.
Right, the idea of an unresponsive crew, possibly due to gradual decompression or hypoxia, lack of oxygen. This was actually the scenario the Australian Transport Safety Bureau, the ATSB, favored for a while.
Why did they lean towards that?
Because it potentially explained the long, silent flight south. If the crew became incapacitated early on, the plane could have just kept flying on autopilot along the last programmed heading until it ran out of fuel.
Consistent with the plane maybe not being actively flown at the very end.
Exactly. Some analysis of the recovered flaperon suggested the landing flaps weren't extended, which might imply an uncontrolled ditching or crash rather than a controlled landing attempt. It fits some pieces of the puzzle.
It's just so many possibilities, none confirmed. The handling of the whole thing also drew a lot of criticism, especially towards the Malaysian authorities.
Oh, definitely. There was criticism about the initial confusion, some contradictory statements early on, and delays in releasing information, particularly that crucial Inmarsat satellite data.
Why the delay on the satellite stuff?
Often attributed to sensitivities around revealing military radar capabilities, what they could and couldn't track, but it caused frustration and fueled speculation.
Yeah, the airline itself, Malaysia Airlines. This is just devastating.
Unimaginably so. Already facing financial issues, then MH370, and just 4 months later, MH17 was shot down over Ukraine. It was a double blow that led to the airline being renationalized by the Malaysian government later in 2014.
And the families.
Yeah.
The legal battles for compensation under international conventions must have been incredibly difficult.
Extremely complex and drawn out. On a practical level, though, the airline did implement new satellite tracking systems afterwards.
Which brings us to the wider impact. Did this change aviation safety globally? Did anything concrete come out of this tragedy to prevent it happening again?
Yes, significantly. MH370 was a massive wake-up call for the entire industry and regulators like ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization.
So what changed?
Several key things, mainly around tracking. By late 2018, new rules required planes flying over oceans to report their position every 15 minutes, down from maybe 30 or 40 minutes before.
Okay, more frequent check-ins.
And for new planes built after January 2021, they need autonomous tracking devices that transmit their location at least once a minute if the plane gets into distress. So even if systems are manually turned off, there's a backup.
That sounds like a direct response to MH370.
It absolutely was. Plus, there were pushes for longer battery life on the underwater lowator. Beacons, the standard went up from 30 days to 90 days by 2020, and longer recording times for cockpit voice recorders, up to 25 hours for new aircraft.
25 hours, wow.
Yeah, covers multiple flight legs, potentially. There was even talk and development of ejectable black boxes or streaming flight data in real time, though that's complex. But the drive for better tracking and data recovery definitely accelerated.
Beyond the rules and tech, though, MH370 just seems to linger in the public mind, doesn't it? Documentaries, books.
Absolutely. It tapped into this deep fear of the unknown, of disappearing without a trace in our highly connected world. It's generated countless theories, some credible, some less so.
Even recent controversies, like comedians making jokes about it, show how raw it still is for many people.
Exactly. It's a wound that hasn't fully healed because there's no closure.
So you've just had our deep dive into Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. We've walked through the knowns, the search, the theories, the aftermath. One of aviation's deepest, most troubling mysteries.
And despite everything the incredible technology used, the massive search effort and the plane itself and the final truth of what happened in those last hours is still out there, unfound.
And there are still new pieces emerging or new ways of looking at old data. You mentioned that hydrophone research.
Yeah, this was just in May 2024 from Cardiff University. They analyzed underwater microphone recordings, hydrophones, from around the time and likely area. They were looking for the sound pressure signature of a large aircraft hitting the ocean.
Like they've heard with other crashes.
Exactly. Other crashes have left pretty clear acoustic signals. But for MH370 and the official search time frame and areas, they only found one single relatively weak signal that might be related, but it's far from conclusive.
So what could that mean? If a big plane hitting the water should make a loud, specific noise, and they didn't really find that noise.
Well, it raises questions, doesn't it? Could the impact have been different from what was assumed? Maybe a gentler, controlled ditching that made less noise, although that seems to conflict with the flaparound data.
Or could it mean they were listening at the wrong time? Or even in the wrong place? Does this hydrophone data challenge the established timeline or the location based on that seventh arc?
It potentially could. It might force a rethink or at least add another layer of complexity to interpreting the existing data. It just goes to show, even a decade later, MH370 continues to pose these fundamental, unanswered questions about its final moments and its resting place.